Jackson has a couple of fictional characters in Epiphenomenal Qualia. One is Fred, who has better colour vision than anyone else on record. He has most of the airtime, but in fact, it's his co-star Mary who completely overshadows him in the subsequent literature and who captured the philosophical imagination. Mary has normal colour vision, but she's never seen any chromatic colours. She's only seen black, white, and shades of grey. I'm a brilliant scientist. She's a brilliant scientist, forced to investigate the world from a black and white room via a black and white television monitor. She acquires, let us suppose, all the physical information there is to obtain about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes, use terms like red, and so on. She knows everything physical there is to know about optics, wavelengths of light, how light is reflected off tomatoes, how photoreceptors work, and so on. What will happen, Jackson asks, when Mary is released from her black and white room? In particular, will she learn anything or not? One possibility is that she won't learn anything at all.
Nothing to see here. That's exactly as I expected.
But there is another possibility.
That's strange. Good grief, I never knew seeing red would be like this.
And Jackson goes for the second option. It just seems obvious that she will learn something about the world and our experience of it. But she had all the physical information when inside her black and white room. Ergo, therefore, physicalism is false. Turning now to Patricia Churchland's paper, Are Mental States Irreducible to Neurobiological States? She is not convinced by the knowledge argument. She criticizes her version of the knowledge argument, that is, the knowledge argument that she ascribes to Jackson. It's not the same as the one that I will set out in a minute, but some of her criticisms also apply to that version. Emotions, I should say, among philosophers do tend to run high on this subject. The whole issue of materialism versus dualism. Philip Goff is a philosopher who works at the University of Durham in the UK, and he just wrote a book defending panpsychism, the view that, as he explains it in this article that I am linking to, the smallest bits of matter, things such as electrons and quarks, have very basic kinds of experience. An electron has an inner life. So on this view, according to panpsychism, consciousness is a much, much more widespread phenomenon than you might have initially thought. Anyway, the other day, Goff tweeted, "The data of neuroscience is neutral between materialism, dualism, and panpsychism. Anyone with a theory of consciousness is doing metaphysics. It's just that some of us are able to admit it." Patricia Churchland did not like this at all. She first said, "This is probably the stupidest thing I've ever read. Amazing what philosophers can convince themselves of. Is physics also neutral between these things?" And then followed it up with, "What about pixie dust, leprechauns, ghosts?" Anyway, here's the knowledge argument according to Churchland. Premise 1. Mary knows everything there is to know about brain states and their properties. Premise 2. It is not the case that Mary knows everything there is to know about sensations and their properties. Conclusion. Sensations and their properties are not the same thing as brain states and their properties. A couple of questions for you. First, is this a good way of setting out the knowledge argument? Second question, is this a good argument? Here's another version which I prefer. See also the Reader's Guide. First premise, before her release from her black and white room, Mary knows all the physical facts, or at any rate, all the physical facts relevant to conscious experience of colours. From that premise, we first derive the conclusion C1. If physicalism is true, pre-release Mary knows all the facts. Or, at any rate, she could know all the facts if she just did a bit of logical reasoning. Now we have C1. Here's another premise, P2. Post-release Mary learns a fact, something she couldn't have known while imprisoned in her black and white room. Okay, so we've got C1. If physicalism is true, pre-release Mary knows all the facts. P2, post-release Mary learns something she couldn't have known before her release, from which it follows that physicalism is false. What about the step from P1 to C1? Why is that plausible? Why does it follow that if pre-release Mary knows all the facts, then if physicalism is true, pre-release Mary knows everything? Here is some motivation for the move from P1 to C1. Remember that if physicalism is true, then the physical facts entail, that is, logically imply, all the facts. Mary is, we may suppose, in addition to being a brilliant colour scientist, also a super logician. So what could stop her, if physicalism is true, from knowing all the facts? She can just deduce them from her physical knowledge. So if we grant the move from P1 to C1, then we've got three options. First, deny the first premise, P1. Maybe for some reason, Mary's impoverished colour experiences when inside her black and white room prevent her from knowing all the physical facts. Second option, deny P2. Go for the first scenario, that Mary just says, hum ho, nothing to see here, when she's released from her black and white room. And the third option, the only one remaining, since we're granting the step from P1 to C1 and everything else is valid, is to embrace the conclusion. Physicalism is false. You may have been wondering about Mary's yellow head. Did she ever see it? The answer is no. Her jailers were careful to keep any mirror-like surfaces out of her monochromatic prison. Could such a simple argument really show something so profound about the nature of the universe? That's for you to figure out. We saw that philosophers have trouble keeping their emotions in check in the philosophy of mind. Fortunately, next week we're going to start a subject that everyone can dispassionately examine without getting overheated: race and gender. Read Appiah and Spencer for Monday. Appiah's paper has lots of interesting material about W.E.B. Du Bois, but you just need to concentrate on Appiah's argument that there are no races. I'll see you then.